Okay, we're going to record this presentation. The first step of our IEP series is entitled, What is an IEP and what is a 504? So today we're going to talk about the differences between an IEP and a 504, so you guys have a better knowledge as to what to expect during this process. So I'm going to give over a quick law review first. There are two different parts of this law. There's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a nationwide special education law that gives rights and protections to kids with disabilities, not only just cognitive impairments, but also physical disabilities. It covers students from birth until high school graduation or their 21st birthday, whichever comes first. And parents and guardians also have rights under this law that protects them and their children. Since this is a nationwide law, the IEPs can transfer across state lines. So just because you have an IEP in Illinois, you can also take that to Missouri, Michigan, or other states within the United States, because this is covering you nationwide. So anytime that you have, if you have to move, even within districts, it's still going to be covered. There just might be some slight differences in terms of what that IEP could cover in that new school district or that new state based off of the state laws that they have there. So they'll want to update it, but we'll talk about more about that once we get to the actual IEPs. Early intervention is also part of IDEA, so all of these policies and procedures are kind of interconnected to cover the entire school age system that a child would come across. So in theory, the transitions from early intervention into school services should be easy and seamless. It's a relatively new process. It's only been around since 1974. The last time that they updated it was in 2004. So under IDEA, this only covers public schools. So public schools must provide a free and appropriate public education to kids with disabilities, and the learning of those kids must occur in the least restrictive environment. Again, we'll talk about more about the least restrictive environment during the fourth part of the series, but this IDEA is not covered under private schools. So like your Catholic schools, your Montessori schools, things of those nature. It only covers within the public school system. Schools also must find and evaluate students who may have disabilities at no cost to the families. So you do not need to go out and get your own evaluation done for your child. If you suspect any disabilities, the school system will provide that free of charge. One distinction is that they're looking at educational disabilities. They're not looking at medical disabilities. So if your child has autism, you have that diagnosis, that will be helpful to provide that information and that evaluation results to the school system. But if, say, your child has ADD, sorry, I'm trying to admit everybody who's coming in, the school system can evaluate whether or not this child needs special education services to meet the needs of that disability. We'll talk about child finds a little bit later in the processes. There's also, some concerns about schools not wanting to bring up concerns to parents sometimes when they suspect that there may be a disability. Some of that has to do with, their systems and policies and procedures to try other least restrictive interventions first before really honing in on the fact that there may be a disability that is causing the child to not be able to access their general education curriculum in the same manner as other kids. However, most of our kids are, individuals like yourself, parents here, present for this discussion today probably already have a diagnosis from their medical team with regards to autism, and that will be used within the evaluation system at CPS or another local school district to show that your child has a disability that we need to take into consideration for an IEP. Schools are also required to give parents a voice in their child's education. Parents have rights and protections called procedural safeguards that helps them throughout this process to ensure that their child's needs are being met within the school system. Other important laws that impact our students, there is Section 504, and this prohibits the disability discrimination of schools that get federal funding. Schools must meet these requirements by removing the barriers to learning. This is super important for young adults because this law requires universities to remove barriers for learning. This means people can still have accommodations up into college. IDA only covers a child up until their 21st birthday. The day before their 22nd birthday is when all of those IDA laws become null and void. But Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act covers for modifications and accommodations that would be needed for young adults to access, their employer systems and things like that. Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA, prohibits disability discrimination by schools, employers, and anyone who offers goods and services to the public. So what exactly is an IEP? This is also known as an Individualized Education Plan. It's a program or a plan that is developed to ensure that a child with an identified disability who is enrolled in a public school receives specialized instruction or services. It will also include the current levels of that child's functioning, both academic and functional living skills, their student goals, their services that are provided, and in what location of those services, your classroom setting, also known as your educational placement, modifications and accommodations, and then for those who are 14 and a half and up, you'll also have a section for transition planning. Section for behavior intervention planning and functional behavior assessments will also be included if your child meets those specifications for it. There's a checkbox that they have to check to indicate that that child needs a behavior intervention plan. Your child has a right to specialized instruction that allows him or her to make meaningful educational progress. I think one thing that we as parents have to understand within the IEP system and the processes is that just because our child has a medical diagnosis does not equal them having an educational diagnosis that meets the needs for IEP services. So we have to pull that from our brain that just because we got that diagnosis from a doctor does not mean that it equates to also an educational disability. So we have to show the school system that our child needs these services because their disability impacts their ability to access general education curriculum just in the same way as their other peers in that grade level. The law requires that the schools to provide what is appropriate or necessary, but that does not mean that it's the best. We as parents may think that our child needs a therapeutic placement or all of these, bells and whistles, so to speak, of our IEP, but school is only going to provide what is appropriate and necessary to meet that child's needs within that school environment. Again, looking at the least restrictive environment is where they want to start so that they can ensure that the child still has access to their general typical peers. And it must be based on current recent information. Whenever you're preparing for your IEP, you want to make sure that you have the most recent data presented by your current service providers. So if your child is receiving speech, OT, PT, social work, or ABA at CPTWC, you want to make sure that you are requesting either progress reports or assessment results that are within the last 6 months. It doesn't mean that their diagnoses from the medical team has to be within the last 6 months. It just means that current progress that they're making with their service providers that they are seeing needs to be within the last 6 months. If your child hasn't had an assessment or a reevaluation in the past 6 months, then just request a progress report from that service provider that will still count as showing the most current and recent information about your child. Under an IEP, you can get a plethora of services. Again, it doesn't mean that your child, qualifies for this, but these are the types of services that will be provided within an IEP. Special education classroom, paraprofessional, either direct one-to-one, where they're dedicated to that child and nobody else has that person, or shared in terms of during certain points of time, that shared paraprofessional may work with 2 students at the same time. Speech and language services, this can be both direct and indirect services. Same for physical therapy and occupational therapy. However, within an IEP, occupational therapy cannot stand alone. So you could have an IEP where the only service that you receive is speech and language, but you could not have an IEP in terms of just having occupational therapy. You need to lump it in with another service that the child is eligible for. Social work services, both direct and indirect services, psychological services, mobility services in terms of having somebody say that they are visually impaired. Maybe they have an itinerant that will help them navigate the school system, or they have to use a walker or a wheelchair or some other other type of modification to help them access that area. Health and nurse services, for example, a child has diabetes and needs to receive insulin shots or get their levels checked, or even just medication that they will receive at their lunchtime, as well as interpreting services for students who English is not their first language. They need an interpreter to help translate things, or maybe they're visually impaired and they need an interpreter in terms of using Braille or some other visual modification. Who can get an IEP? At the beginning, I mentioned that you need to have an educational diagnosis in order to qualify for an IEP services. So IDEA has led out what exactly type of diagnoses may get you an IEP within the public school system. And the child just has to have one of the following: either a specific learning diagnosis, other health impairment, ADHD is listed under this, autism spectrum disorder, emotional disturbance, speech and language impairment, a visual impairment, deafness, hearing impairment, deaf and blindness, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability, traumatic brain injury, as well as multiple disabilities. That includes a multiple diagnoses for that child. So if your child qualifies under any of these diagnoses, they more than likely will get an IEP service within their educational setting. If something is not listed, it may be linked into some others. Like I said, ADHD is listed under other health impairment, but there may be, diagnoses that are listed here that may not include your child. Adverse effects, again, just because a diagnosis from that list is not enough to qualify for an IEP. So there's a common misconception is that a student with a disability that was diagnosed outside of the school automatically qualifies for an IEP or a 504. We have to show evidence of adverse effects of the disability on their educational performance, because we're looking at the school. We're not looking at, how well are they functioning with, taking care of themselves, responding to instructions, things of that nature. We're looking at how does their disability impact their ability to access that educational setting. For example, there are students with ASD diagnoses that currently do not receive services in school. Maybe they just have a 504 and they don't have a full IEP. Some students with ASD may not have those adverse effects that would lead them to need any type of school services in order to access everything. Very rarely, but it does happen. So how do we go about and get these educational diagnoses for our children? So schools will recognize, as I mentioned before, the diagnoses from outside evaluators. So if your child has autism, the diagnosis from a neuropsychologist or a neurologist or a developmental pediatrician, the school will help them to provide them with an IEP. You just need to come forth with that information so they can read the report and things like that. Schools can also provide the diagnoses. Thinking back to the child find system, we want to make sure that the schools are adequately finding as well as identifying those kids that have disabilities so that they are receiving the services that they need within the school system. Again, it's important to note that the criteria for diagnoses in school is different than what we're used to, because there needs to be an academic component to the diagnosis, not just, their social, emotional, functional diagnoses, but all of the academic components that are taken into place. We require for our services, for insurance-based services, a medical diagnosis, but this is different than that school educational diagnoses. Moving on to a 504. This is different from an IEP. So an IEP has a plethora of services and things like that that go into it. You can receive academic goals, paraprofessionals, you can receive educational placements, things of that nature. The 504 is a separate portion of the law. So this provides services and changes to the learning environment to enable students to learn alongside their peers, and ensures that an individual with medical disability requires accommodations to ensure their equal access to the learning environment. So it's important to note that direct services cannot be provided through a 504 with the exception of social work. That is the only direct service that can be provided under a 504. All others like speech, OT, PT, any of those things would need to have an IEP in order to provide those services. It is for a student who needs certain modifications within their school environment. These plans are not as restrictive as an IEP and does not provide specialized instruction. So there is no goals listed in a 504. It's basically just looking at accommodations and modifications to help make those changes to that learning environment so that the student can learn alongside with their typical peers. 504 is also generally, it is for those who can function in the gen ed setting, but need some accommodations. When a student is being excluded from an activity due to their disability, a 504 plan is needed to provide accommodations and supports to access both the academic and extracurricular activities. The accommodations don't change what the child is learning, it's just how they learn it. And the goal is to remove the barriers and give the kids access to learning. So most of our kids who are here present at CPTWC in our academy program would likely qualify for an IEP versus a 504. Generally, you don't see both of them together. Very rarely would you see an IEP and a 504. It's usually one or the other. And again, 504s are more likely to be provided for those who have a disability, but that can access their general education curriculum with just the needs of some accommodations and modifications, and would not need any type of specialized instruction or direct services in order to do that. The 504 protects individuals with disabilities in multiple areas of life, including school, employment, health services, and helps protect them from discrimination. Remember that an IEP only goes up until the day before their 22nd birthday, whereas a 504 goes the whole entire lifespan. You can have 504s to help them access issues within their employment setting. College is a very popular one in terms of needing a 504, especially for children who have ADD or ADHD or some other learning disability where they are learning at the general education curriculum but need some accommodations and supports. It's available to individuals with disabilities that substantially limits a major life activity or is regarded as handicapped by others. There is no specific evaluation for a 504. They require a diagnosis of a disability, but there's no formal testing that they'll do. And they do not need to actually confirm that the child has that diagnosis, to just require the diagnosis of disability to review that process with them. Determination is then based on a variety of documented services and sources, and the timelines and procedures for evals are not dictated by law. Whereas within an IEP, there are timelines and procedures that dictate, when do you get your evaluation? How long is this supposed to take in terms of that process of, once you sign that consent, the evaluation needs to be done within 60 days. And then the IEP process starts in terms of writing up the IEP and evaluation results. So the 504 is dictated by the section of 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and there are no federal legal requirements. So what makes the 504 kind of tricky is that parents don't have any rights under this law in terms of advocating or, ensuring that their student is receiving the services. Your child could be 12 years old and could, attend their own 504 and say what they need and things like that. And there's no requirement for the parents to even be present or notified. So it is kind of a little tricky with that. That doesn't mean that you can't advocate for what you feel is necessary for your child, especially, a 12-year-old may not know what exactly they need in order to have that protection. There's no federal funding. And again, there's fewer rights with a 504 and does not require specialized instruction. That's going to be provided within your IEP. So in terms of what can be provided with a 504 as compared to the IEP, you're looking at, again, those accommodations and modifications that you would have so that they can access the learning. So preferred, most of this stuff is if you take and think about children with ADD or ADHD, preferred seating to be seated next to or close to the teacher or at the front of the room to limit distraction. So their attention is more on the focus of the teacher versus their other peers in the classroom. Extra time on tests, where that is state assessments or local and regular school assessments and classroom tests. Use of a speech to text for writing, especially for kids who may not have really great fine motor dexterity and are unable to write. It creates too much pressure as well as tires them out and things like that. They can use speech to text to help them for any writing. Modified textbooks such as audiobooks, having tests read to them, especially if they have visual impairments and it's harder for them to read, or maybe they cognitively process the information better if it's read to them. Taking a test in a different room, whether that's a hallway or a study hall or things like that. Providing movement breaks every once in a while to ensure that they are taking a break and not getting overstimulated. Students who take medication during the school hours will also need a 504 in order to go and seek out the nurse for those services. Those who received postoperative care, so such as crutches, wheelchairs, walkers, or things like that, and it's a very temporary position that they're in, can also receive a 504 so that they can access and navigate their school system, maybe utilizing the elevators or things like that, leaving class early to transition to the next class, things like that to help them for that temporary period of time. For example, students with diabetes, or they need to leave the classroom to get an insulin injection, they can have a 504 written so that they can have snacks during certain parts of the day. Or again, like I said, needing to leave the classroom in order to receive health services for an insulin injection. So as you can see from these provisions in a 504, it's much different from the IEP where we're looking at just the accommodations and modifications in order to access that learning. When to refer for a 504 versus an IEP. If a student does not require specialized instruction, but does need to have equal access to the public education, we're looking at a 504. So if your child, is at general education and curriculum and meets that need, but they need to have more equal access to the public education, then it's probably looking at a 504. If your child is below general education curriculum and needs specialized schools and services in order to help them access the curriculum, you're looking at more of an IEP. There are fewer procedural safeguards in place for a 504 than an IEP because 504s are covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And under this civil rights laws, students have the right to a free and appropriate public education, just as you do for IDEA. And that's the whole point of 504 plans. It's just to give students access to the same education their peers are getting. I have some, hold on. Exit out of here. I'm gonna go before I open it up to questions. That was really quick, but I wanted to bring up child find real quick, as well as some of the timelines to kind of help you guys, because I know we're getting into school services right now. So child find, and I'm going to talk about this in a second presentation, but I wanted to give you guys a heads up. Child find is a service within the state of Illinois as well as nationwide, but it's basically supposed to help school districts identify and find students who may have a disability. So when you're thinking about the IEP process, there's different ways to identify a child with a disability. One could be parent referral. Two could be school referral, and three could be through child find. CPS has these child find screenings. This is not an evaluation. This is just a screening to see if your child has any markers that would indicate that we need to do a fuller evaluation to identify the disability. There's no appointment that's necessary for these screenings, but they're all held at libraries during different days of the month. No Saturdays, it's all during the week. It's between September and June of 2025. There's no appointment, so you don't need to email anybody and say, hey, I'd like to schedule an appointment to go to the library. If something doesn't work for you with regards to this, you can email CPS childfind@cps.edu to contact your child find coordinator to schedule something. But if it's listed on any of these dates, you just show up at the library to do the screening. I would caution that sometimes on certain days of the week and things like that, it used to be more popular on Saturdays, but sometimes there might be a little bit of a wait. So make sure that if you do show up to the library, that you have some activities or things to kind of keep your child engaged while you wait for the screener to be available to provide that screening to you. These are children who are not enrolled in Chicago Public Schools. So these are kids that are more than likely less than 5. Anybody who's older than 5, pushing into 6, will need to be screened or evaluated at the school themselves. So this is mostly for early childhood clients not receiving any early intervention services for the Chicago Public Schools to identify any child that may have a disability to push them further into the evaluation process. I will send this out to all of you so you have access to this so that you can see, what libraries participate in that child find screening. And then again, the days of the week that they offer them. Usually it's once a month for like West Belmont Library, does it on Fridays. The next one is February 7th. They'll be there from 9:30 to 3. So they're there for a very long time. But recommend, planning ahead, making sure that you yourself have enough time, as well as you yourself have things for your child to do in case you're waiting a long time. The next one that I'm going to share with you is just some timelines. We'll go into this more specifically with the rest of the series, but I wanted to make sure that you guys have an understanding. Again, 504s do not have any timelines, procedural safeguards, or anything in place that helps protect the rights of you as a parent or your child or things like that. But there are very specific special education timelines that need to be followed, and these vary from state to state. IDEA sets up timelines, but each state can indicate how they're going to, basically the reiteration of the law, like IDEA says this is what we're going to do. Common thing is IDEA says that once you sign the consent, you have 60 days to have the evaluation complete and the IEP written and that meeting held. Each state can determine what that 60-day means. Does that mean 60 calendar days, 60 business days, or 60 school days? And as we all know, school days have lots of different holidays, half days for Teacher Institute, parent-teacher conferences, and things like that. So it can really elongate the system. Follows the 60 school days. So when you're thinking ahead and you're starting to plan for this IEP process, you have to take that into consideration because they can take up to 60 days to get the evaluation complete. So I'm going to send this out to you all so that you have access to it, as well as a good resource for Equip for Equality. They have a lot of information on their website about IEPs, advocacy, and things like that. But there are, again, certain IEP timelines that you have to meet, and if the school district isn't meeting that, then they're breaking the law. Many times schools do not tell parents, what the process is. They're not going to help you to understand what IEPs look like or what your rights are under the law. They're just going to share with you, like, have you got your procedural safeguards? Here they are. Make sure you read them. They're not going to walk you through what each step kind of looks like. So it's on us as parents to kind of educate ourselves as well as help each other to make sure that we're identifying when the school is not meeting that need or that timeline and procedural safeguard, so that we can call them out, so to speak, to ensure that our child's rights and our own rights are being upheld by the law. So I wanted to kind of give that as a brief, introduction that we'll go over these timelines in more fashion at a later time. But it kind of included in the IEP process for this first initial series in terms of the differences between a 504 and an IEP. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to you guys to see if anybody has questions, because that was a very quick and brief understanding of IEPs versus 504s. But from the looks of everybody that's on this, I can only assume that most of your kids are going to qualify for an IEP versus a 504. Does anybody have questions? And you feel free to put it in the chat too if you don't want to talk on the recording. Okay, I will take silence as a good sign that you sort of understand the differences between an IEP and a 504. One thing to note that if you guys ever have questions or concerns or want a better understanding, or you want to meet more directly with me one-on-one, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to meet with any parent to walk through it as it is more specific to your own child or your own needs and things like that. I've been working with lots of parents lately on that IEP process to ensure that you guys are, more than ready for those meetings. So feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to kind of meet with you more directly to speak on how this applies to your child. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day and I look forward to seeing you next week. If there's any questions at all, feel free to email me. Thanks, guys.